Hello, denizens of the internet. My name is Winnie Weedy Vorthos, and I like to make Vorthos Magic the Gathering decks, and have been doing so for almost the entirety of my years playing MTG. For those of you who don't know, a player who identifies as Vorthos is a flavor player, which is to say that we care about telling a story with our cards. There are a lot of aspects to being a Vorthos player, and I won't go over all of them now, but essentially, what that means is that a Vorthos player cares about themes and deck cohesion that goes beyond purely mechanical aspects of the game. For me, that means I like to build decks around themes, tribes, and occasionally specific cards. Oftentimes I try to utilize cards which come from the same plane on which the focal cards are featured, or, lacking that, cards from planes which a character I happen to be building around has been to. With these loose guidelines in mind, there's one other important deck building guideline to which I adhere. I always strive to make my decks as competitive as possible. Now, that's an important distinction to make because of this equally important caveat. I do not build my decks typically in order to combat the meta. The reason for that is simple and twofold. First, I am under no illusion that I hold some secret knowledge on how to beat decks which the best players in the game are piloting. I don't pretend that their traditional wisdom trumps mine. Second, well, I'm a Vorthos player. I value flavor over most everything else, and the sad truth is that making a mechanically streamlined and efficient deck always comes at the cost of deck flavor. Nevertheless, I do strive to make my decks as good and functional as possible, and I'm not afraid to use cards which are seeing play in the meta for the sake of boosting efficiently, so long as doing so doesn't detract from the flavor of the deck. Got it? Good. Now, you might be asking yourself, what's with this long preamble? I feel that it's important in this, my first video, to set the stage and expectations for this channel and what it is that I'm trying to do with my deck building process. I don't want to give any sort of false pretense that my decks are going to crush all of the menaces in any given time and any given format. That's not realistic and simply not what I'm trying to do. I'm just a funny little guy making funny little decks that, on a good day, when luck is on our side, will sometimes come out on top against decks that a spike player is piloting. Make sense? And to start this journey off, I felt that it was only appropriate to begin with the deck that, for me, started it all. No, I don't mean the very first deck I ever built. That was a Demir deck that a friend of mine helped me build out of a huge pile of bulk cards that I was gifted. Nor does it mean the first deck which I built a theme around. That will get its own video in the future. No, this deck, is about the start of my journey as a Vorthos player, as someone who first began to take interest in the story that Magic the Gathering was telling, the worlds and characters that inhabit those worlds, and that deck is a Nicol Bolas deck.
And plague into your house, into your bed, into your streams, into your streets, into your drink, into your bread, upon your cattle, on your sheep, upon your oxen, in your field, into your dreams, into your state, until you break, until you hear. I send the sword, I send the horde, thus saith the Lord.
Nicol Bolas is one of the oldest and most powerful antagonistic characters in all of Magic the Gathering's history. An Elder Dragon turned Planeswalker, twin of the Spirit Dragon Ugin, winner of the Elder Dragon War, menace of the multiverse. His accolades and feats are far too numerous to list off here in their entirety. One of the most popular characters that Wizards of the Coast has ever created, Many MTG fans, including myself, are drawn towards the enigmatic, some would say evil, charisma of this draconian planeswalker. His schemes and misdeeds, confidence and cunning, are positively magnetic, and I first took notice of him when I first saw the card Cruel Ultimatum. Now, at the time, I was just getting into Magic, had been playing for maybe a year or so at the most, on and off, and the first thing that drew my eyes was the casting cost. It seemed insane to me that such a big spell with such specific casting costs could be cast in the first place. And then I read its effect and was blown away by the power of this card, and what really caught my attention was the flavor text. There is always a greater power. I had heard a similar expression before, there's always a bigger fish, and I remembered thinking that maybe it was just a clever little take on that saying. But then I looked at the art, and I mean really looked at it. I was just beginning to really appreciate artistic composition at that time, and so I studied the artwork and was blown away by it even more than the effect of the card. The figure, who I would soon learn to be Nicol Bolas, was absolutely dominating the frame, standing in front of the light source and towering over who I would eventually learn was Sarkhan Vol, the captured moment depicting what I would, again, later learn was Nicol Bolas' touch of madness applied to Sarkhan as a punishment for failure. The menacing glare of Bolas, the disgusted snarl on his mouth, the floating stone between his horns. I was entranced by everything about this card, and I naturally found myself wondering just who were these characters, and so I set out to learn more, which would lead me to Nicol Bolas' original card. I looked at this card and thought, what? No, that's not Nicol Bolas. It doesn't look anything like Cruel Ultimatum. Why is he so derpy? Why is he reading books? Is he sitting in a chair? Why does the card look fake? Needless to say, this was how I more properly learned about the older editions of the game and how older cards looked. I had a few older cards from sets of years gone by, but none that looked quite as dated as this one. Thankfully, there existed another artwork of this card that I would find soon after and would set me on the right track to becoming a proper Vorthos player. Now this was more what I was expecting. A much more menacing dragon, once again dominating the frame and bathed in a similar light as he was depicted in Cruel Ultimatum, though slightly different from how he looked there as well. I'd come to learn that this creature card version was his pre-Planeswalker self, which of course led me to discovering what a Planeswalker was, and that Cruel Ultimatum was depicting him after his ascension. I was again marveled at the casting cost of this card and its effect, and yet again, it was the flavor text that caught my attention the most. Dominaria's most ancient evil. A simple line of text just like Cruel Ultimatum's flavor. But it got me even more curious. What was Dominaria? Just how ancient was Nicol Bolas? Just how evil was he? And so began a much lengthier dive into Magic the Gathering's lore and stories as I learned even more about everyone's favorite evil Elder Dragon. You see what I mean about this deck starting it all yet? From 2 cards and 2 lines of flavor text, I got interested enough to go searching for more, discovering new aspects of the game and lore, and opening up all sorts of doors for me as a player and a deck builder. After learning what I could about the Elder Worm for the time being, I felt in my gut that I had to build a deck around him. I'd never really built a deck in Grixis colors before, and yes, I did learn that Grixis was the term for blue, black, and red color combination because of Nicol Bolas, and I was eager to make something that would represent this character that I had fast grown to like. The problem was, there weren't all that many cards depicting Nicol Bolas at the time. You gotta understand, the year was 2011 or so. I was just starting to really get into MTG, and aside from Bolas' creature card and Cruel Ultimatum, cards that depicted him were few and far between. Fortunately for me, the Nicol Bolas Dual Deck product had come out recently before my discovery of him, and with it a bunch of reprints that I at first mistakenly thought made them modern legal. I had pretty quickly learned from friends who were teaching me how to play that modern was the format I wanted to play most at the time, and so that was the format I was trying to construct this deck for. So cards like Nightscape Familiar and Deep Analysis excited me, right up until I figured out they weren't modern legal, thanks to people I played with online. What followed was a long and strenuous process of trial and error, figuring out what cards worked, what didn't, which were good, which weren't, and putting them into a deck together, and it was bad. Like, really bad. Looking back on that deck now, I was playing with such a horrendous mana curve, and it's honestly embarrassing to think about how I just shoved cards into a deck and expected it to win. But, for my losses, I learned. I got better at the game. I got better at building decks. I learned some important lessons like, hey, maybe it's not a good idea to have 4 copies of an 8-drop that you can only play one of at a time in a deck that's moving at a glacier's pace. Maybe try putting in some more cheap cards that bring that down to a 1 of. The more I played with the deck, the more I refined it, the better I became. And eventually, through sheer pluck and the grace of a metagame that was very different from how it is today, I actually started winning games. Eventually, though, the deck ran out of steam for me. There really were only a handful of cards that either depicted or referenced Bolas at the time, and only so much I was willing to bend on playing cards I outright knew I didn't want to be playing with it, like Snapcaster Mage, Dark Confidant, and Thoughtseize. Yeah, I understood that these were good, powerful cards. I was certainly losing enough games to them. But for this deck in particular, I quickly decided that I didn't want to play cards just because they were quote-unquote good. I wanted to strike that balance between form and function, and so, after a while, the deck went dormant for me. I went on to build other decks, and took the knowledge I'd gained from brewing around Nicol Bolas and started to experiment with other cards and decks, and maybe we'll get to those another time. Eventually, though, it happened. Amonkhet arrived. Oh, it was beautiful. A set that was designed and entrenched around Nicol Bolas, filled to the brim with signs of the Elder Dragon's influence. It was amazing, and I have very fond memories of attending pre-release for Amonkhet as well as sets that came after it. Finally, I had new cards to search through and brew with, and what was more, there was going to be another set right around the corner. Hour of Devastation, an equally wonderful set that I had equally fond memories of. To this day, Amonkhet remains my favorite plane due in large part to the Dragon Planeswalker's influence on the plane and how it shaped out. But most important of all, I had a lot of new cards to try putting into the deck and building around. I remember having a lot of fun trying out Kefnet, Bontu, and Hazoret in the deck in various combinations, and some part of me wishes that the design of them lent themselves to what the strategy of the deck would eventually become. Kefnet ended up staying the longest out of the 3 of them, but alas, even Kefnet had to go eventually. Nevertheless, there were some cards that stuck around in the deck and persist to this day, and that held true for the 2 next big Bolas theme sets, Hour of Devastation and War of the Spark, with a very important addition from MTG 2019. After War of the Spark, however, Bolas was forced off center stage and the deck had since entered another period of dormancy, more or less, with only the addition of a single new card from the recent sets of the past couple of years. That brings us to the present day, the deck list as it is now, and the beginning of the actual deck tech. know this was a long and winding road to get to this point, but I felt it was important to tell the story of how I got here with this deck in particular, because in much the same way that this was the first video I have made for this YouTube channel, this deck was the start of me taking deck building seriously in Magic the Gathering. As I said, this deck helped me make many strides over the years, and thus is very important to me because of that. And while future videos of mine likely won't have this long preamble before we get to the actual meat and potatoes of the video, I wanted to take you on this short journey through my own personal past with this deck so that you could better appreciate the thought process that went into designing it as it is, with the deck building caveats kept in mind that I opened this video with. And now, without further ado, let's look at the deck list. This is a Grixis control deck that is looking to do a couple of things. Gradually bring the opponent's life total down through incremental effects and value, and slow down the game enough that we can play and protect our main win conditions, Nicol Bolas in all of his various forms. To win with this deck, you need to have a keen understanding on what cards to counter and when, which pieces of removal to utilize on what, and most importantly of all, do not rush in or panic. I would personally describe this deck as a hybrid between control and aggro at heart, but I cannot stress enough that even having general knowledge of what it is your opponent is playing greatly increases your chance of victory with this deck. In short, you need to think like Nicol Bolas. Hit your opponent where it hurts them the most every time it's in your ability to do so, and play for the long game, because this deck does not want to win quickly. It wants to be patient, cunning, and brutal, just like the featured character. It only feels appropriate to begin with the dragon himself and the main win conditions of this deck, Nicol Bolas. By now, it should be obvious what the theme for this deck is, and with that being the case, we are running most versions of Nicol Bolas that have ever been printed as one-ofs. Well, most of them, anyway. Nicol Bolas, Planeswalker, God-Pharaoh, and Dragon God are all singleton copies in this deck respectively, and each and every one of them can win the game on their own through their own abilities, each of which, on even his oldest Planeswalker card, are absurdly powerful, as befitting the Planeswalker to end all Planeswalkers. Starting with the oldest for 8 mana, 4 generic, 1 blue, 2 black, and 1 red, we get a 5 loyalty Planeswalker with 3 abilities. The first is add 3 loyalty and destroy target non-creature permanent. The second, -2 loyalty and gain control of target creature. The last, -7, we get a juiced up Cruel Ultimatum, causing our opponents to lose 7 life, discard 7 cards, and sacrifice 7 permanents. This Planeswalker is back-breaking if it manages to stick around, and if the cards are in your favor, you should be able to control the game through counterspells and removal up until you can play this version, or another, and then start to close out the game. In my experience, by the time we get a Bolas Planeswalker out, especially the big ones, we're usually ready to end the game regardless, and with these around, it won't take much longer. Next we have the actual namesake of the deck, Nicol Bolas, God-Pharaoh. For 7 mana, 4 generic and Grixis colors, we get a 7 loyalty Planeswalker with 4 abilities. +2 loyalty, target opponent exiles the top card of their library until they exile a non-land card, then we can play it for free until end of turn. +1, each opponent exiles 2 cards from their hand. -4, and God-Pharaoh deals 7 damage to target opponent or creature they control. And -12, exile all non-land permanents our opponents control. If the first Bolas was backbreaking, this one is devastating, with the ability to win on the spot sometimes if it comes down and is able to deal 7 damage to our opponent, disrupt their hand, let us steal and play cards from our opponent's deck, and board wipe everything that isn't ours. This is maybe the most powerful version of Bolas there is. Having the ability to just win the game if your opponent is at 7 or less life really makes this version in particular strong in this deck, as you'll see. Now we move on to the technically most powerful Bolas, Dragon God. For 5 mana, 1 blue, 3 black, and 1 red, we get a 4 loyalty planeswalker with a static ability and 3 active abilities. The static ability gives Dragon God all loyalty abilities of all planeswalkers on the battlefield, and this is why it's technically the most powerful version, along with only costing 5 mana. A +1 ability to draw a card and force each opponent to exile a card from hand or they control, -3 to destroy target creature or planeswalker, and -8 to just win the game on the spot if our opponents don't control a legendary creature or planeswalker. Winning the game with Dragon God's -8 is maybe the biggest flex this deck can pull off, and it's not entirely unreasonable to do it once you get to controlling the game, but the first 2 abilities will see much more play, unfortunately. The static ability, however, is where this Bolas really draws his power from. Disregarding the fact that he is effectively any and all planeswalkers your opponents happen to be playing as well, simply having the ability to copy your own Bolas Walker's abilities is monumental. God-Pharaoh's -4 and deals 7 suddenly becomes 14 damage with both him and Dragon God out, which in this day and age is more often than not enough to end the game against most any deck playing fetch and shock lands. And that's just one ability from one of the Bolas Walkers the deck runs. Doubling up on all our own Walker abilities makes him worth running alone, but imagine using your opponent's abilities against them. Teferi, Time Raveler, Liliana of the Veil, Renin 6. All of their abilities become yours as well, which is where my earlier statement about knowing when to let things resolve comes into play. Sometimes, if we have a Dragon God in hand, it's more advantageous to let our opponents play their walkers, get away with having them for a turn, then playing Dragon God, using them against our opponent, and then getting rid of them if at all possible. In general, Dragon God is going to be of more value to us than their walkers will be to them, so be mindful and try to think a couple of turns ahead when you have a Dragon God in your hand. The last Bolas in the main deck is the Ravager, a combination creature and planeswalker of which we are playing 2 copies. For 4 mana, 1 generic in Grixis colors, we get a 4/4 flying Elder Dragon that makes our opponent discard when it enters the battlefield. Honestly, some games this is enough to win you the game. Just the creature side. A flying 4/4 beater that makes your opponent discard a card is nothing to sniff at, especially in combination with the other ways we can end up dealing damage in the deck. Protected with counter spells and removal, sometimes you will just win the game with the Ravager. Then, for 7 mana, for generic and Grixis, we can transform it at sorcery speed into Nicol Bolas, the Arisen, a 7 loyalty planeswalker with 4 abilities. +2, you draw 2 cards. -3, and Bolas deals 10 damage to a creature or planeswalker. -4, and we reanimate a creature or planeswalker from any graveyard under your control. And -12, we exile all but 1 card from our opponent's library. As is the trend with Bolas planeswalkers, Arisen is brutal in so many ways. Drawing 2 cards alone is really good, as traditional wisdom tells us. There are few creatures that will survive having 10 damage dealt to it, and even fewer planeswalkers, but it's reanimating other creatures or planeswalkers where Arisen truly shines. With this ability, which can be used as soon as he flips over, we can steal the best creature or walker that our opponents has played and we've removed, attempted to play and we've countered, or just get back our own creatures or planeswalkers, with Bolas cards taking priority, that our opponents have managed to get into the grave. Typically, if we flip this and we manage to get a second Bolas walker out, we are in a dominating position and ready to end the game. Arisen's -12 ability is much like Dragon God's in that if we manage to use it, we're probably flexing, but it's a cool way to win the game if you manage to make it happen. Still, the real power in this version is the -4 ability. So those are the primary win cons of the deck. The cards we're stalling the game out to play first and foremost, because they will win the game, sometimes on the spot. But what about the secondary win con? Discounting the games where we may win through incremental damage and other conventional means. The secondary win con of the deck is Cruel Ultimatum, a card so good that it has historically had its own deck archetype, Cruel Control. After all these years, I'm still in love with this card. It's just plain cool, really. But on top of being cool, it's really powerful. I'm sure if there have been some games that you've played where 5 points of damage would have won you the game, let alone the other effects this card has. There have been plenty of games I've won off the back of this card because it's surprisingly easy to get someone down to 5 life or less in a format with greedy mana bases and a deck that has ways of dealing incremental damage. For that reason and more, we're running 2 of them. Only 2, because much like every Bolas that isn't a creature, getting the exact 7 mana required to cast this spell can be tough. You don't want to have too many of these in your hand or else they'll just sit there doing nothing. But what does this card do, exactly? Well, for 7 mana, 2 blue, 3 black, and 2 red, we get a sorcery that deals 5 damage to our opponent, makes them discard 3 cards, and sacrifice a creature. Meanwhile, you gain 5 life, draw 3 cards, and return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. This card is nothing but upside for you, the caster, and, much as the theme of the deck, can be devastating to your opponent if it resolves. If it doesn't outright win you the game, usually it will put you in on the fast track to winning by getting you that much further ahead. I should also point out that for the purposes of building this deck as Vorthos of a deck as possible, only the version featuring the Dragon Planeswalker himself will do. So, those are the main ways we want to win the game, resolving one or multiple versions of Nicol Bolas or casting Cruel Ultimatum. So what else is in the deck? In this deck, we are only running 2 other creatures in the main board that aren't Nicol Bolas the Ravager, and the creatures that get the honor of being with their master are Augur of Bolas and Harsh Mentor. Augur of Bolas is a 2-mana 1/3 Merfolk wizard for 1 generic and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, choose an instant or sorcery spell from among them, reveal it, and put it in your hand, while the rest go on the bottom of your library in a random order. The Augur is a simple but effective creature in this deck that does basically everything we want it to do. In the early game, it's an effective blocker against quite a few creatures thanks to the fact it has 3 toughness, and even if it doesn't survive the block, that's fine because its ETB effect is what we care about the most. Getting to dig 3 cards in our library to find an instant or sorcery card is a wonderful bit of utility, effectively replacing itself in hand after you cast it with something that you can use in the turns to come. If, for some reason, the Augur manages to survive a few turns as well, it can swing in for some small bits of damage here and there. Sometimes people won't take the trade and will just lose a bit of life, which is what we want to happen in this deck. And if our opponent uses a removal spell on it or attacks with a creature and we have to block, it served its purpose. Augur of Bolas is the epitome of a minion, the perfect disciple of Bolas. Useful, disposable, and it fuels your future turns. For these reasons, we run 4 of them. For maximum flavor, be sure to use the art from War of the Spark. As a final note, I should mention that you'll want to pick your battles with this creature and have an understanding of the board state. This is another card where knowledge of your matchup is key, as, in some games, you'll want to have this come down, give you a card, then die immediately, while in other games, through careful manipulation of the board and what spells your opponents cast, over several turns, the Augur can swing in unimpeded for several points of damage. Remember to be aggressive when it's appropriate and reserved when it's better to be defensive. That's the best way to make use of this tool. The only other creature in the deck is Harsh Mentor, a 2-mana 2/2 human cleric for 1 generic and 1 red, who has the effect of whenever an opponent uses an activated ability of a creature, artifact, or land that's on the battlefield and isn't a mana ability, Harsh Mentor deals 2 damage to them. A card that was once hyped to the ends of the earth only to face the reality that it's pretty easily removed. I've always had a soft spot for Harsh Mentor despite the fact it doesn't live up to its hype. The reason is simple, really. Despite the fact that it's easily removed, just like Augur of Bolas, it makes for an excellent minion in this deck. Making a fetch land cost 3 life instead of 1 is reason enough in my book to want to run it, but believe it or not, there are plenty of cards within the modern meta that see play and will be sniped by Mentor's effect. Mishra's Bauble, Urza's Saga, Agatha's Soul Cauldron, the One Ring, just to name a few cards that will be punished for being used so long as Harsh Mentor is on the field. Now, granted, it may only see a couple of triggers off its ability before it's removed one way or another unless your opponent is particularly greedy or doesn't care about life loss, but the important thing is that it can and will hurt your opponent without needing to attack if it goes undealt with. At worst, it's a red bear and a small beater in our deck, the same as Augur, and in that case, it can still get in and deal 2 damage for us, or be useful as a blocker if needed. Or it's a removal magnet, and a card our opponents use their removal on to get rid of ASAP so that they don't have to deal with it shocking them every time they try to do something other than tap mana. In any case, Harsh Mentor serves his master Nicol Bolas well. Those are the creatures, so what else is in the deck? It may surprise you to learn that we're only running 2 counter spells in this deck. Yet both of them are full play sets, and both of them, in their own way, are all-stars in the deck. This is where the incremental value really starts to come into play with the card selection of this deck, but let's go over them one at a time in depth. Counter Squall is the most Nicol Bolas counterspell to ever counterspell. For 2 mana, Dimir colors, we get an instant that counters a non-creature spell and deals 2 damage to our opponent. Simple, effective, amazing. Counter Squall is a counterspell of choice for the Dragon Planeswalker, and for good reason. For just as many colored pips as regular counterspell, we get to counter some of the most troubling cards in the format as well as shock our opponents in the process. Now, granted, Counterspell does counter 1 more card type than Counter Squall does, but it also doesn't deal 2 damage, which is huge in this deck. If it's not apparent by now, a major part of the way this deck wins is through small bits of damage all throughout the game, gradually whittling our opponent's life total down until they're in range of God-Pharaoh, Cruel Ultimatum, or lower. When piloting this deck, you aren't countering spells just to counter them. Nicol Bolas doesn't stall, he constantly works towards his goals and actively does everything in his power to see them come into fruition, and Counter Squall is a perfect example of that. By dealing 2 damage on top of countering 8 of the 9 card types, you are actively moving the game towards your victory rather than just stalling out your opponent, and that's why there's a full play set of it in this deck. For maximum flavor, you'll want the Dual Decks version of the card featuring a quote from the dragon himself. The second counterspell we play is Supreme Will. For 3 mana, we get an instant with 2 motes on it. Either counter a spell unless its opponent pays 3 mana, or you look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library. For the purposes of this deck, this card is pulling double duty, acting as both a counterspell when needed, as well as an additional playset of Augur of Bolas when it's not needed as one. With the big difference being that it digs 1 card deeper and you don't have to reveal your pick, and you can pick any card you like. Setting aside its utility as a counterspell without ignoring it entirely, the main use for this card is to dig for cards you need when you need them, typically at the end step of your opponent's turn. Once again, matchup knowledge is key with this card, knowing what you can and can't deal with resolving. If you absolutely cannot let a spell resolve, then keep this in hand and wait to counter something. But if you have Counter Squall in hand and a piece of removal alongside it, you're likely safe to use its second mode and go digging for something you might need more in the moment. Or, just maybe, it can find you the card you need to end the game then and there. A versatile instant to be sure, which is why there's 4 of them in the deck. The one thing that this deck excels at more than anything else is getting to the later turns of the game. As such, it's important to keep your hand full of cards and know when best to use them so that you don't run out of gas in the early or mid-game. Having ways to draw cards in a control deck like this is a no-brainer, and we've already gone over how 2 cards replace themselves when you play them. But as for out-and-out card draw, we run Pull from Tomorrow. For X and 2 blue, we get an instant that lets us draw X cards and discard 1 card. Easily one of the best feelings when playing this deck is getting to turn 8 or so, having a bunch of untapped lands, and then playing this at the end of your opponent's turn to draw an absurd amount of cards all at once that ends up helping you finish out the game. Or, one of the worst feelings is having to do so during your turn to desperately try and find an answer to something that happens on the board. But, if that's what you have to do in order to stay in the game, it's what you have to do. And being able to draw a ton of cards all at once like that is pretty sweet. In either case, it's best to hold on to this card until you're able to draw at least 4 cards off of it, if you can help it, in order to maximize the effectiveness of this card. 3 of them will suffice for the God-Pharaoh's purposes. So now that we've gone over counterspells and card draw, it's time to go over removal, which is the bulk of the deck. Cards like Counter Squall and Supreme Will are meant for those things which removal cannot take care of. Nicol Bolas doesn't really care much about most creatures because he can crush them at his will, and the removal suite we run reflects that. Lightning Bolt shouldn't need any explanation. It's ubiquitous to MTG in general, one of the best removal spells ever printed, one of, if not the best, burn spell ever printed, and in this deck it can be used for both, bolting creatures or bolting our opponent's life total to get us that much closer to winning the game. We're running 3 of them in the main board. Similarly, Fatal Push I feel needs no introduction at this point. Inarguably one of the best removal spells ever, it's here to be efficient and deal with all the little to mid-sized threats that run around the modern format like it always has. It deals with everyone's favorite monkey, the menace that is Bowmasters, Dragon Rage Channeler, and if Revolt is triggered, heavy hitters like Grief and Yawgmoth as well. Now, Revolt is not as easy to trigger in this deck as it is for others, which is why clever usage of it when you want to target something bigger than 2 mana is key. Remember, this is a control deck. Don't be afraid to hold up a fetch land if you suspect your opponent is about to play something that will require the Revolt trigger, especially if you have more lands in hand. This deck runs 3 of them. Tyrant Scorn is a unique removal spell for us that serves a similar purpose as Push does. For 2 mana, Dimir colors, we get an instant that has 2 modes on it. Destroy target creature with mana value 3 or less, or we can return a creature to its owner's hand. More often than not, especially in the early game, it'll be more beneficial to use the first mode to outright remove creature-based threats our opponents are playing. However, the second mode shouldn't be overlooked either, as it can target any creature regardless of its mana value and gets around things like Indestructible. It's always nice being able to disrupt your opponent's big creature plays as well by just sending it back to hand, which can clear the way for one of our creatures, or give us the second opportunity to counter it if we just so happen to have Supreme Will in hand that we didn't have mana for. Additionally, and I know this isn't going to be optimal in a lot of cases, but it should be stated that this can be used to put Evoke Elementals that have been scanned back into your opponent's hand. Yes, this does give your opponent the opportunity to scan them again, but they aren't always going to have the material to do so, and even if they do, you've effectively made them 2 for 1 themselves twice in a row, which puts card advantage squarely in your favor, allowing you the chance to counter or remove them at a later point in the game. Of all the Evoke Elementals, Grief is the worst to do this against, unfortunately, as it attacks our hand where we like to keep our stuff. So, if you can, you should always go for Push or Bolt to kill Grief outright, rather than put it back into hand. Fury doesn't matter as much to us because we don't play many creatures, same with Solitude. And if you happen to run into Subtlety or Endurance, our other pieces of removal can easily take care of them. Lastly, I want to go over how Tyrant Scorn can be a unique protection spell for us, returning our creatures back to hand if they're about to get removed and letting us get additional use out of them on a second casting. This is by far the rarest scenario in which we will use Tyrant Scorn, but it can be important to know about nonetheless. The order of priority you should give this use for is Nicol Bolas the Ravager, Augur of Bolas, and lastly, Harsh Mentor. As I went over earlier, both the Augur and Mentor are just minions in this deck, here to serve their purpose and die more often than not. But Nicol Bolas is a win condition, so keeping him alive if we can help it can be a way to go. Augur of Bolas is definitely less valuable, but its ETB trigger can net us some much needed spells. Harsh Mentor you should only bother to save in matchups where you know your opponents will be activating a lot of non-mana abilities that you can get as much value in burning them out as possible. Otherwise, you should be fine just letting the Mentor die, either having done its bit of chip damage or soaking up a removal spell from our opponents. The last card we run in the main deck that isn't a land, and our last piece of removal, is Damnation. Once again, Damnation's use is pretty ubiquitous, I feel, as it's a board wipe. Board wipes are almost always relevant, but everyone can remember a game in which they needed a board wipe in their deck but didn't have one, and that's why Damnation is here, to serve as the contingency plan. It's unfortunate that we can only make room for 2 of them in the deck, as I'd like to have at least 3, but this deck list is ultimately pretty tight, and there aren't many places that we can make cuts for extra copies of cards unless you want to trim cards off the top end, which would lower the number of win conditions we have as well as lower the amount of Nicol Bolases, which, no. Just no. For maximum flavor purposes, you should absolutely run the Invocation version of Damnation for what I hope is obvious reasons. Those are all the spells we're playing in the main deck, but what about the mana base? I have to tell you up front that figuring this out was difficult, especially for a younger me who was just getting serious about the game. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the right balance of how many lands to run, what types of lands to put in, how to fix the mana properly, and what I learned was quite a bit over the years. I know that this mana base might look a bit suboptimal or clunky, but trust me when I say it works like a dream if you know what you're doing. Before going over the mana base, I do want to say this up front. The most important color to start the game off with is blue. You will always want to have the land you play on turn 1 be blue. We need blue for basically everything that isn't push, bolt, or mentor. This deck mulligans fairly solidly, but if there's one thing you want to aggressively mulligan for, it's an untapped blue source. Now, with that said, on to the actual mana base itself. To start us off, we're running 6 basic lands in the deck, 2 of each island, mountain, and swamp. I choose to run the full art basics from either Amonkhet or Hour of Devastation for that extra bit of flavor, but honestly they're just basics. Run what you like or what you have. You might be thinking that this is a bit of a high number of basic lands to be running in this deck, but it's honestly kind of the perfect number, letting us have a good amount of lands that don't hurt us when they enter or get used, let us fix our mana easier, and give us plenty of options against decks running removal like Path to Exile, Assassin's Trophy, and Field of Ruins. I know that these aren't as popular as they once were, but I, for one, think that one of the most feel-bad feelings in this game is being given the opportunity to find a basic but not having one in the deck, so I like running them as 2 of each. Next we're running the Grixis check lands, 2 of each for a total of 6. Of all the dual-colored non-basic lands that aren't shock lands, these are probably my favorite, because their condition for entering untapped is so easy to meet. Between the basics, fetches, and shock lands that are in this deck, it's pretty easy to play whatever we need on turn 1 to make sure that a check land is online on turn 2 and onward. The only downsides to them are if you have a hand which does not have a land which can untap them once they're played, in which case, why did you keep that hand? and they require you to do some thinking ahead when evaluating your opening hands to determine when you should play them or what you should fetch up in order to get all of your colors on board as quickly as possible. Both of these quote-unquote downsides, though, come with the caveat that playing with them in mind ultimately make you a better player of the game, helping to train you to evaluate your opening hands better and think a couple of turns ahead. And for a deck themed around Nicol Bolas, thinking ahead is exactly what we want to be doing. Speaking of fetch and shock lands, of course we're running the gambit of Grixis ones, but only one of each. That might seem shocking to some of you, but let me explain. In my many years of playing and refining this deck, I found that oftentimes a lot of the games I could have won were undone by me doing damage to myself from my own fetches and shock lands. Of course, I don't deny their utility and versatility, but personally, I don't like losing games because I keep hitting myself. That's why we're only running one of each. Rather than relying on the handy-dandy, simple and clean solution of just being able to find what we need when we need it with a bunch of fetches and shocks to have on-demand mana, I've opted to instead conserve my life total and instead use the check lands and basics to offset the lack of instant color fixing. I don't want to say that fetches and shock lands are no-brainers in their use, because you absolutely do need to think about them at times, but I for one definitely feel it's better to think ahead and just use the check and basic lands in order to save our life total. Lastly are our utility lands, and each of them serves a specific purpose in the deck. Emergent Zone are only one of the utility lands. It's nice to have around and hang out for the long games where we can get to turn 8 and beyond, allowing us to sacrifice it and play our sorcery speed cards at instant speed. Typically, this will either be Damnation, Cruel Ultimatum, or one of our Bolas win cons, clearing the way or sometimes just winning on the spot because of them. It does only add colorless mana though, which is why it's only a one of. The scenarios in which we actually use it are rare, so best not to have too many of them and hold on hope for sneaking a win like that. Better to just keep the possibility in our back pocket. Next we have Creeping Tar Pit, a classic manland that we're running 2 of in the deck. This is our secret 4th creature in the deck that served us well over the years, letting us swing in for 3 damage unblocked anytime that we have enough mana available to play around anything our opponents might be holding up in their hand, and sometimes become the prime bit of aggro in our deck. The fact that it's unblockable is great. It's a classic controlled card for a reason, and, much like most things in the deck, its purpose is to get our opponent's life total down low enough that we can end the game with one of our finishers in tandem with everything else dealing a bit of damage here and there. The last card in the main board, as well as the newest inclusion in the deck, is Takenuma, Abandoned Mire, of which we are running 3 of. Aside from having blue as our preferred first color of mana we want out on the field, the next color we want most is black, so tipping the scales a bit in that direction is good. But of course, the real reason that we're running it is the channel ability. This is our insurance against any sort of removal, mill, or hand disruption that our opponents play that would get one of our Bolases into the grave instead of on the battlefield where he belongs. The mill is a negligible downside in this deck since we can just get back anything important, and if we're channeling this, it's likely to get something back that's important to us winning the game in the first place. The worst case scenario is that we channel this to get something like an Augur of Bolas, but if we do that we're likely in a losing position anyways, and the mid use of this channel is to just play it as a black mana source. In any case, this is a good, strong card that serves the Dragon God well. That's it for the main deck, but what about the sideboard? First off, running 1 copy of the original Nicol Bolas and additional copies of Ravager and God-Pharaoh in the sideboard. Nicol Bolas, the original, is mostly here for sentimental reasons, I freely admit it, but a 7/7 flyer that makes your opponent discard their hand is still a powerful card, and it really isn't difficult to make games go long enough to get to 8 mana in this deck. And once you're at 8 mana, having to tap 3 in order to keep him during each upkeep isn't that much of a downside. I bring this Bolas into games where I want to have more fun, or sometimes by trying to psych out our opponents who may or may not see the number of Planeswalker Bolases that we're running in Game 1 and try to sideboard in answers to that. Pithing Needle doesn't mean anything against a creature with no activated abilities, after all. The other two copies of Ravager and God-Pharaoh are here for games where you need to be more outright aggressive with your win conditions rather than controlling. Having a third copy of Ravager just ups the chances of you getting them sooner for more beats, more discard, more chances to flip him as the game goes on, and as I said earlier, God-Pharaoh is probably the best Bolas walker there is for his ability to win games on the spot, so having a second copy of that is simply the more aggressive line of play. For all three of these, you'll want to swap out different versions of Nicol Bolas that are in the main deck so that you keep the mana curve more or less consistent between games. Do not make the rookie mistake of thinking more Bolases are better than less. Trust me, I learned that lesson a long time ago. Similarly, for games you need to be more aggressive, our fourth copy of Lightning Bolt gets to hang out on the sideboard. There are very few games where you would want less copies of Bolt in your deck overall going into game 2 and 3, and even fewer where you wouldn't want more. So with a spell as good as Bolt, I feel it only fitting to make sure we ran the full playset in the deck somewhere. Sweltering Suns is here for games where more board wipes are needed rather than fewer. 3 mana, 1 generic and 2 red, to deal 3 damage to all creatures works pretty well against most decks that like to go wide with little guys. Worst case scenario, you can cycle it away to draw a card at the end of your opponent's turn if you feel like you don't need it anymore, which is nice to have as an option, really. 2 of these give us a nice even 4 board wipes in total. Dispossess is here to help get rid of any and all copies of our opponent's most troubling artifacts, which, in this day and age, likely means the One Ring or Colossus Hammer, but can, of course, get anything that's troubling you and make sure that all copies of it are disposed of. Between this and our counterspells, there's a good chance that they won't bother you in games 2 and beyond. 2 copies. Scavenger Grounds is here to deal with any and all graveyard-based strategies that our opponents might get up to. This card is most definitely for our opponents and opponents only, as we run only a couple of cards that care about the grave, so the odds of our opponents getting way more value out of theirs than we are of ours. For games where this is needed, I recommend swapping out Emergent Zone and a check land or a basic land of your choice to make room for this. You definitely don't want to go over or under the 24 land count in this deck. Deliver Unto Evil is for games where our opponent has a lot of removal, mill, or hand disruption that takes away cards we need. A miniature and ultimately worse Gifts Ungiven with Bolas flavor. If we manage to make it to the mid and late game and we have one of our Planeswalkers out, this card is all gas for us. If not, which most of the time we won't, we can try being smart and force a tough choice onto our opponents that will benefit us either way, helping us to get back what's been taken from us. Try not to cast this card if you have less than 4 cards in your grave, if you can help it, as with 3 your opponents will ultimately be choosing which cards to give back to you. In some scenarios that choice can be made easy, like if you happen to unfortunately have 3 copies of Nicol Bolas in your grave and you have the mana to cast all of them next turn, but you really do want to maximize what you get out of this card, so try and use it whenever you have 4 or more cards in the grave. 2 copies. The Elder Spell is for very specific matchups and scenarios, but is worth running as a one-of nonetheless. If you happen to be playing a game against a Super Friends deck, or you end up in a scenario where you have multiple Nicol Bolas walkers in play, the most typical scenario for this being if you have Dragon God out and a second walker in hand, or a Ravager on the field that you'll be able to flip, the Elder Spell can be used to get one of your Bolas walkers up to the point where they can use their ultimate abilities and or win the game on the spot with one of their other abilities. It's niche and rare that this will happen, but it does occasionally, which is why there's only one of it in the deck, same as Emergent Zone. Last but not least is Alpine Moon, rounding up the sideboard with 2 copies, and this comes in against decks that have greedy mana bases, dealing with all the usual suspects. Tron, Urza Saga, opposing man lands, utility lands with activated abilities, etc. Once again, matchup knowledge is key to the best use of this card. Knowing what to turn off in which decks is how you get the most use out of it. And that's the deck! Nicol Bolas Control, a control deck designed to win through incremental damage, precise removal and counter spells, stalling the game while still actively moving towards a victory until you can play one of the big, game-ending spells that you will have spent the early and mid-game building up towards. Truly a deck befitting the scheming dragon god, filled to the brim with flavor and balanced with efficient, powerful cards to support the rise of the multiverse's most imminent threat. I hope that this deck tech has given you an understanding of what I meant in the beginning by building Vorthos decks which are as competitive as possible. Every card in this deck is put in there for a purpose, and most of them are either related to or feature the titular Nicol Bolas in art, flavor text, name, or influence of the character. The only exceptions are those cards which are too efficient to go without in order to make the deck as powerful as possible while still staying on theme, such as Fatal Push. But that of course begs the question, what if you wanted to have more efficiency than flavor? What if you care about making a deck as powerful as possible with only a minimal amount of flavor? There are several ways to improve the deck in that manner that I will go over now. Honestly, making specific recommendations purely for mechanical upgrades is difficult for me for this deck in particular. As I explained towards the start of this video, this deck has a lot of history and sentimental value to me, so changing it for the sake of making it more competitively viable for the current modern meta feels bad to me. Nevertheless, I would be remiss and dishonest if I said that the deck was perfect, done, no notes possible. It's simply not true, and unfortunately for me, any major changes that this version of the deck I've spent the past little while going over will have to wait until Nicol Bolas inevitably returns to the MTG story and once again steals the show, getting more cards featuring him and his machinations. For those looking for mechanical efficiency, here are some suggestions on where you could start. Confounding Riddle is a new card from Lost Caverns of Ixalan that is just Supreme Will, but better. If you like the versatility of being able to counter a spell or dig through your deck for something you might need more, this would be a rather easy card to swap out. Or, alternatively, if you'd rather have a counter spell which acts more aggressive, you might want to consider Ionize, making it so that all your counter spells double as burn spells. The nice thing about Ionize, aside from the burn and costing the same amount as Supreme Will, is that there's no clause for your opponent to get out of the spell being countered. Just a flat-out counter of any card type along with a shock for good measure. I've honestly considered running this card in the past because I like this aggressive style of countering spells and may yet in the future, but I personally prioritize flavor in this deck list. Nevertheless, Ionize, in my opinion, is a very good counter spell. Of course, if you want the most bang for your buck, very little beats the original counterspell or the oft-times free Force of Negation, both of which would be solid upgrades to the counterspells in the deck if you wanted no clauses on what you're countering, free spells, and don't mind games going a bit longer as a result of not running Counter Squall. If you don't like or don't want to run so many Bolas walkers in the deck, you could always swap them out for Torment of Hailfire as a replacement win con. It still works as a control finisher and is on theme, which is nice, but it can be used at most points of the game to help you get ahead, which is also nice. You can also, of course, run all 3 copies of Nicol Bolas the Ravager in the main board and even bump it up to a full playset if you wanted. I would, at the very least, recommend that you keep Dragon God in the deck in some number, however, as a way to instantly win the game if it sticks around for a few turns, combined with the counter spells and removal the deck runs to make sure your opponent has no legendary creatures or planeswalkers. If you're looking for upgrades to creatures, adding scam elements to the deck is, of course, an option. I'm pretty sure that 16% of modern players, as of the time of recording, would agree that these cards are, as the kids say, pretty good. and so make for easy and obvious ways to replace Augur of Bolas and Harsh Mentor for creature cards that are categorically more aggressive, if not also more expensive financially. If you wanted to change the mana base, you could trim down the number of basics and check lands, up the amount of fetches and shocks, remove Emergent Zone, and add in Xander's Lounge as a one-of to ensure that your check lands are online no matter what, or some number of utility lands, such as Sokenzen, Crucible of Defiance, and Otawara, Soaring City as additional channel lands for just that extra bit of utility. Otawara in particular may actually be worth running in this deck in some number because of its ability to return things like Leyline Binding and the One Ring to your opponent's hand. But personally, I rely on my counterspells to stop such threats from happening in the first place. Sokenzen making a couple of spirits to help swing in for more damage could be useful as well for putting pressure on and ending games faster. The sideboard is honestly where the deck could probably improve on the most. Swapping out Sweltering Suns for more copies of Damnation, for example, would be an easy upgrade if you prefer non-damage based board wipes. Thoughtseize is another ubiquitous card that can easily be included in either the main or sideboard if you wanted to be extra controlling of what your opponent does. Cards like Feed the Swarm and Debt to the Kami can help cover a glaring weakness in the deck, enchantment removal, which you might want to have on hand to deal with Leyline Bindings or Up the Beanstalks. Cast into the Fire is an answer for the One Ring and other artifacts that have Indestructible, something else that this deck can struggle with, and so on and so forth. There are a number of upgrade paths that this deck can be taken down in order to improve it and make it more competitive, more streamlined. But the more you do, the less Vorthos the deck becomes, until, eventually, you're left with a generic Grixis control deck that happens to maybe run Nicol Bolas, the Ravager, as a potential finisher. And that's how I feel this deck would become after all these upgrades. Just a generic Grixis control deck, not a deck built around the God-Pharaoh. Now, we've gone over the deck, we've gone over upgrades you could make if you wanted them, but what about weaknesses? Where does this deck struggle the most? Where this deck struggles most is against decks which are white and green, surprisingly. This is because decks which can ramp and accelerate their mana into big threats that the deck isn't capable of dealing with, going wide in order to play around the limited creatures we run, getting big and going over said creatures with trample or evasion are all ways to defeat this deck before we get to the late game, which these colors in particular are great at doing. Similarly, aggressive, low-to-the-ground decks like Burn, Goblins, and Merfolk always have the chance to simply outpace us. In these matchups, it is possible to stay on top of the game with removal and counter spells, but it very quickly becomes a question of who runs out of gas first, and if you're in a game where you feel compelled to use what removal and counter spells you have to deal what's on the board or being cast, then the pressure is on you, because these decks are very much better at re-establishing themselves than you are once disrupted. This is a slow-paced deck that wants to take the game slow, and decks like Burn and the like are all about the fast life, which can make them difficult to deal with. Something else that the deck struggles with is artifact and enchantment removal, namely because the deck doesn't really run any. You more want to stop such things from being played in the first place than you do remove them, and the deck is usually much more concerned about removing creatures, which typically represent a more direct threat to the outcome of the game than artifacts or enchantments do. Nevertheless, prominent cards like Leyline Binding and the One Ring are inevitabilities you will likely come up against at some point or another, and there may be other artifacts and enchantments, such as in a Dice Factory or Enchantress deck, that you may find yourself struggling to keep up with, like the aggro decks, if you are unable to keep on top of them. But I feel like I've done a pretty good job of fleshing this deck out. I've gone over its strengths, weaknesses, given a bit of story on how it came to be made, and made suggestions for upgrades you could make if you were so inclined. What do you think? I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you do, please consider subscribing for more deck techs in the future, hitting the like button, and leaving a comment of some kind, sharing with anyone you think might be interested in this kind of content. This is a new channel, and I'm hoping to make a name for myself and all other Vorthos players out there. Until next time, I've been Weenie Weedy Vorthos, and thank you for watching.